All right. Well, welcome everyone. We are now in contact meeting number 25. I heard some talk of vacations. Hope you're all enjoying the summer and getting to spend some time relaxing and enjoying the nice weather. Today, let's see, not today. Last meeting, just to refresh your memory, we had a great conversation about land use efficiency measures. And we introduced the topic of um, critical path property facilitation for incorporation. And today, our focus is on improving urbanization outcomes. We're going to start with a brief conversation about the Goal 14 boundary location factors, and then spend most of our time discussing parcelization and the coordination of public facilities. And Maddie's going to lead most of those conversations today, but before we get there, I'm going to hand it to Karin to talk about our focus area and questions for the racial equity framework.
Yeah, I think we last talked about these urbanization or Goal 14 topics back in October of last year. And one of the themes that came up around these topics was just the availability of information and data, and maybe some disparities from one county to another or from one local municipality to another, and what folks have available to them when they are looking at what do they know about how they're housing their community members, what socioeconomic disparities exist, what disparities are disproportionately impacting communities of color. And I think the conversation today around the location, the Goal 14 boundary location factors, when we think about the Goal 14 and statutes around urbanization and urban growth boundaries, that prioritization of land that comes in, and what we think about what does it mean for that land that's parcelized, that rural residential land that's exception land. What is a community? What does that mean for a community to urbanize that? And when that comes in the urban growth boundary. And then when we think about extending urban services, and all of these conversations really ask us to think about not only what do we know about our current community, but what information, data, or qualitative pieces of information do we have to plan for future communities. And so that next slide brings up some of what we've heard from all of you all around not every city is equipped in the same way to gather the information. The information may not even be available. Some cities and counties have very limited information from federal census data. And then other cities have a lot of staff capacity to go through the data and really plan and think, who is being served, who's being underserved, what are the disproportionate impacts, and then what do we want to change? What do we know about our current conditions? And when you think about urbanizing and taking urbanizable land, whether that's annexing into your city and growing that way, or if you have a land deficit and having to expand an urban growth boundary and allocate additional land, you're starting to plan for what does that mean for employment land? Who gets these jobs? Who does that serve? What does that mean for residential land? What types of housing and who's going to be served by that housing? And the folks who live there, what are their job opportunities? The folks from the employment land that work there, what are their housing opportunities? And we start to see the economic disparities around income and housing affordability and housing types available. And all of that comes with a very coordinated approach of efficient use of land and good urban form and providing urban services. And it becomes a really complex web of trying to understand who's being served, who's not, and then how your community wants to grow and what they want to change about who's burdened and who might be benefited. So I thought I would bring that back from comments that we've heard throughout these conversations and focus our thinking there as we think about our Goal 14 urbanization work.
Thank you, Karin. And as I mentioned, Maddie's going to lead our conversation today, and we're going to start, I think, with boundary location factors. Go ahead, Maddie.
Thanks, Steve. Hey, everyone. I hope everyone's enjoying summer. I know I just took a short walk, and it's definitely fruit grazing season. So if you're lucky enough to walk around town and find neighbors and friends with fruit in their front yards that are leaning over the right of way, it can be a really tasty adventure. Today we're here to talk a little bit about boundary location factors and the sprawling set of concepts and challenges that I attempted to organize in the memo that you all received. And I'll start by apologizing to some extent that memo felt pretty hectic and disorganized in some ways because the concepts kind of bounce around. It feels like a smorgasbord of different challenges that cities encounter between the time that they declare that they have or establish that they have a land need and the time they select a sub area for inclusion in the growth boundary. So our focus today will be on sections 65 and 67 of Division 24 of the administrative rules. As you have and as well the goal 14 location factors, which are that overarching guiding principles that we follow related to that goal. You all provided some great feedback and conversation that way back in October of last year, meetings 11 and 12, and you shared a series of concerns on the Miro board. I've shared in the memo the areas that are included in this conversation. There are yet still items that are not addressed that are included in orange in that memo. I just wanted to acknowledge that we heard those from you. We just haven't addressed them yet. And we hope to reach those topics either through further conversation on this topic or at other points in our discussion over the next couple months. With the exception of impracticable to serve, which is in section 65 of Division 24, the conversation today will really focus on the interrelationship of these factors with rule language in Division 2467, which have to do with preserving the land prioritization rules and ways to support cities navigating them, and how utility costs determine preference for selecting land that ought to either be excluded from the study area or selected for inclusion in the growth boundary. And ultimately, sort of the big picture is that it all seems to boil down to knowing how much effort is involved and cost is involved in extending utilities to certain places, and the tension that creates with our land prioritization scheme as described in Division 67 or Division 24, Part 67. With that, I'll move us into the first area of conversation, just to refresh our memories about Goal 14 and the balancing location, the location factors. Cities are intended per rule to balance these factors. No one factor is more important than another. They include things like accommodation of land needs, public facility provisions and public facilities and services, the comparative environmental, energy, economic, and social consequences, sometimes referred to as EC analysis, and compatibility of proposed urban uses with nearby agricultural activities. That's one of those orange items that we haven't addressed yet. But just to start us off today, I thought it would be valuable for us to think through whether or not there are particular refinements. It wasn't really evident in some of the work that was provided in the Miro boards or the conversation in our conversations back in October. But before we dive into these really specific concepts and potentially conversations about them, I wanted to make sure that there was room in this conversation to talk at this very highest level about Goal 14 and whether there are challenges that present themselves that don't really fit in somewhere in our other conversation, and potentially even think about whether or not folks have specific language concerns about some of the ways that the location factors are either worded or included in rule language as it stands today. So I thought I'd open it up first to your concerns or questions to see if there are any refinements that you might want to offer that help us better, that could better inform the balancing components of the boundary location factors. And if there aren't that many, that's okay. But if there are, it would be worth sharing here before we get into specifics.
Thanks, Maddie. And maybe not to put anyone on the spot, but Kevin Young, I don't know if you hear frequent, questions or concerns from folks in your position that come to mind that you want to share as well. That's just an offer. You don't have to.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to say here. I mean, one of the issues that comes up a lot in the context of the location factors, but also in terms of UGB exclusion areas, is infrastructure costs, whether things are impracticable to serve. That's an issue that a lot of communities grapple with in terms of the UGB decision. I will say, in terms of the Goal 14 factors, there's a fair bit of discretion for local governments to balance considerations within those factors. So, cities need to demonstrate that they've looked at environmental implications. They need to look at demonstrate that they've looked at cost implications. They need to look at outcomes. Are the outcomes equitable, or is there any potential there for an inequitable outcome as part of that analysis? But that balancing is required under the language, and the goal doesn't prescribe a particular mix or balance in terms of how a local government is to balance. Looks like I may get a rebuttal from Al, but that's my 10,000-foot perspective, I guess.
Thanks, Kevin. Go ahead, Al.
Kevin, you'll be shocked. I agree. I agree with what you had to say about the fact that these are some fairly wide open factors, and there are places where it is really important to be able to put up some borders and boundaries, and places where it's important to give local jurisdictions to look at their own situations. And this is the kind of thing where issues like what Karin was talking about, the concerns of folks out in the exception areas about how their property changes. That's a social factor that if they bring it up, it may be an issue for one jurisdiction and not for another. Same is true when you have a jurisdiction like, Eugene, Springfield, for example, or Bend, where getting from one urban growth boundary to the other urban growth boundary, clear across the urban area, is never more than half an hour. I never even have to use a drop of gas in my plug-in hybrid when I navigate the Eugene Springfield area. It just isn't an issue. Getting to and from work, all those kinds of things. So in another jurisdiction, because of the way that it's configured or what it's surrounded by, it may be that one of the candidate sites is kind of way out in the boonies and hard to get to. And that would make it relevant in terms of access for lower income people. My personal big concern is that we leave the door wide open for jurisdictions to consider relative goodness of fit with the housing needs analyses when you're looking at urban growth boundary expansions. And that in particular has to do with the extent to which someone like Brooks Resources comes in and says, well, we're going to have this much multifamily, and we're going to have a certain amount of deed restricted. We're going to do this, and somebody else does something else. Those are all relevant social and economic factors that it's important to be able to balance when they are brought up. But I personally can't figure out a way to put a fence around those one way or the other. So I think it's important to maintain that discretion.
Thanks, Al. Go ahead, Beth.
So I kind of wonder if maybe it's in guidance more than in rule, but a little bit of suggested definition of what one or two of these are, like efficient accommodation of identified land needs. that's always been vague to me. Like, what does that mean? I've operationalized it as things like connection with the existing uh, community, like road connections, that kind of thing. A good urban form, which is of course a poorly defined concept in a lot of ways. I imagine that it also has something to do with the types of housing and the affordability considerations, but maybe some sort of more description in guidance would be helpful on a few of these. And I'm raising that question because I don't know if other people think that that's a good idea or a bad idea.
Thanks, Beth. Mary Kyle?
Thanks. I think I think your original question about what things have I seen over the years about these four balancing boundary location factors that's kind of stumbled. I see on number 3 comparative, which is the EC analysis, it tends to be a lot of paper that I'm not sure anybody pays attention to. And I would hope, and maybe this isn't guidance, I'm going to follow Beth's pattern on that, to pull out what's really useful, and in particular, climate issues, which that is where one place where those should come into consideration. We're seeing both in the programs at DLCD, the Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities, and Metro's Climate Smart Communities, and a lot of cities, the true, committed desire to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, particularly from the transportation sector. It's a statewide goal. And I'd like to see that built more into our consideration of boundary location, as well as the trade-offs between expansion and redevelopment and infill inside an urban growth boundary and intensifying uses inside. So I'd like to have more meaning as opposed to just a lot more money in paper thrown in the third factor. And then on the efficient accommodation of identified land needs, and there I'll talk to housing needs. I hope that this whole process means that when there is an urban growth boundary expansion for residential uses, we actually see housing needs identified, met in part in those expansion areas. That really hasn't been the case thus far, except for some work that Bend has done, or some more creative one-offs that the legislature has done where they've tied it to providing affordable housing. But it should just be a matter of course, I think, more diverse, compact, and relatively more affordable housing. And I just haven't seen that except in some ones that are not commonly found.
Thank you, Mary Kyle. Brock?
Sorry, I had to find my mute button. So for considering all these things, right, we have to balance them. No one is more important than the other. What if a land use decision, like or a location, boundary location decision, if it advances like 3 and minimizes 1, or it harms 1, I guess, is that going to be, that's still allowed, right? So if you have somewhere that is more efficient for the accommodation of land need, like Mary Kyle was talking about, making sure those areas that are brought in are actually developed, right? It's easier to get the public services there throughout that whole area, right? And comparative social, right? But if that creates an issue where, say, there's a rural residential parcel that currently exists, or a handful of them, and you bring those in, and now those develop at urban intensities, well, they were adjacent to other farm or forest activities when they were in rural residential land. Now they're creating a conflict there. Does it make sense to bring those ones in when currently that rural residential land is acting as a buffer between urban uses and forest and agricultural uses, right? So maybe it doesn't make sense to bring that in if it doesn't necessarily meet, the efficient accommodation of that need, right? It's you have property owner willingness. That's not necessarily all going to develop at the same time. That means you're going to have more difficulty getting economic provision of public facilities in there, right? Because you're only serving one parcel that's going to develop more intensely at one moment, and then you have to do the same thing for each of the others. So I just want to make sure that, we're thinking about those things. And the other thing that I would say, as far as like considering climate in here, I think we should start considering how much input is needed into the soil there, right? If it's not high quality soil, it requires lots and lots of nitrogen fertilizer to keep it in production, right? That's a huge contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. I think it's somewhere between 10 and 12% of our state total. Maybe not specifically for nitrous oxide, but I think it's some higher, more so than it is for like methane. But agriculture still does account for 10 to 12% of our greenhouse gas emissions statewide. And they're more potent emissions, which means we're getting rising temperatures faster than their carbon equivalents. So yeah, I do encourage us to look at that. But let's make sure that we're not just excluding the ones that we don't want to consider. We're actually looking at everything there.
Thanks. Yeah, definitely a balance of all four factors. Maddie?
Well, Steve, I was just going to move us on to the next topic, just as a natural segue here. Thanks all for your thoughts on balancing the location factors. We're going to talk a little bit more specifically about a few areas of concern and some suggestions or proposals. Again, these are first version proposals. So in the last few meetings, we've been talking about version 2s and version 3s of some of our proposed language, and we're sidling up to the exciting stuff. Not to say that the others were not, but this is certainly area where there are lots of details to consider and trade-offs to talk through. So I appreciate your contributions to these conversations, and also constructive criticism as you have it. These are ideas that we're trying to work through as a team, and we hope that you're going to provide us with some good sideboards about what really floats and what doesn't. The first challenge that we'd like to talk through today is parcelization, and the instance of usually rural residential exception land in areas in proximity to existing urban growth boundaries of cities, and the fact that rural residential exception land is by definition a first priority in the land prioritization schedule. Our system as a whole, our land use program as a whole, is designed to keep urban uses in urban areas and rural uses in rural areas for the most part. We have these exceptions that are somewhat in between those two places. So there are areas, sometimes they were developed prior to our land use program's inception. Sometimes they occurred naturally because of other steps that folks were able to take in the interim. And there are some considerations to think through. One is that we're thinking pretty deeply about urban form and thinking about bringing those rural residential exception areas into a more urban space, the urban growth boundary, and kind of identify their eligibility for urbanization. I think one of the conversations I had highlighted pretty discreetly that if it were just rural residential use, a house on a 5-acre lot or something like this, and it was only ever going to stay 5 acres and one house, the situation wouldn't be as pressing. But we've seen in subsequent legislative sessions efforts to try to increase the intensity of use of those properties. We've heard requests and bills floated, some of which have been more successful or have more legs than others, where can we put an accessory unit? Can we put another dwelling unit on those properties? Can we start to see their intensification of use sort of at an incremental level? And this kind of speaks to some other concerns and questions that have been raised by others, which are how might we address some of the governance concerns and questions around intensification of use of rural land like that. So some of the things that were just highlighted in the last conversation about conflicts, and then also the opportunity to potentially resolve some health hazard questions about what happens when on a fairly larger scale, like a whole subdivision that's done in the county, have a number of septic systems that were all put in at the same time, and they all start failing at the same time. And how might we Consider now that a city's growth area is really in really close proximity and their service opportunity might be within that planning period, is it appropriate for those septic systems to be replaced and guarantee that they'll remain separate from that urbanized area until the next cycle comes through? And so I think I wanted to start out this conversation by at least laying out that problem statement. And as we think through the current practice about how these lands are treated, and then also think about some of the ways that we might consider encouraging or supporting cities in meeting their the land prioritization scheme. You all had a lot of commentary about parcelization and some of the challenges that cities have in urbanizing those areas. I wanted to at least speak to that, and also speak to some of the places in rural where parcelization is highlighted. So one of the places in Division 24, Section 67, subsection 6, which speaks to 1 and 2 acre parcels. And 1 and 2 acre parcels have a safe harbor in place right now, which says a 1 acre parcel is assumed to have 1 developable unit capacity, and a 2 acre parcel can maybe developed or assumed to have a 2 unit capacity. You all had a fairly robust conversation back in October about what about the land that's somewhere between 2 acres and 5 acres. You know, I think there may be some conversation about parcels that are larger than 5 acres may have more development capacity, or have a higher likelihood of converting to urban densities. Again, one of the greatest challenges we face right now is that there isn't a lot of information or data to rely on related to this topic. And so one of the things that we've been talking through as a team and want to bring to you for your consideration, advisory committee members, is thinking about how to realistically discount the capacity or the assumed capacity that parcelized land that's less than 5 acres or less in size, that's in the immediate study area of an existing UGB, that is not within close proximity of existing city utility services. So I used in the memo, I drew from the section 5 that's immediately before the section 6 that I spoke to in subsection 67, to show where we've considered parcelization related to employment uses, and there's this existing conditions qualification or existing development patterns, excuse me, that speaks to where are the buildings and where are the utilities relative to the buildings, and could that potentially be a qualifier for how a city is able to parse through whether or not parcelized land, this rural residential exception land, may be considered for a discount to be brought into or selected or brought into a city's growth boundary. So you'll see on the screen that there are some proposed rule changes. You also see in the memo, there is some draft language that I'll put up on the screen in a moment. And the idea is that existing lots or parcels less than 5 acres in size may be assumed to have half of their assumed density, achieved density as assigned by of that comprehensive plan designation as determined in a city's BLI due to existing development patterns as described in the section above, section 5, sub A, sub B. And that might be a reason why a city could bring in that land or be encouraged to bring that land in over a selection process that tries to avoid it or exclude it. I won't talk too much more there because I think folks will have a lot to say. And so I'd like to turn it over to you all and open the conversation about this. Again, first draft, everything is on the table. Thanks for your constructive comments.
Go ahead, Al.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, thanks, Maddie. That was really helpful. I just would like to raise a sort of an editorial issue, which is that it seems to me that we should probably be using the word yield instead of discount. I know we have to prove that we're not having too much, but we also have to prove that we have enough. I don't think there is an assumption or a presumption written in anywhere about any of this. So we're really looking at finding out how much you get out of those parcels. I don't think it necessarily changes the mathematics at the end of the day, but it looks a lot less like we think we're giving people some kind of a big deal. And yield is more closer, I think, to the spirit of the statute and the goal.
Great, thanks. Damien?
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Maddie. I had a clarifying question on the proposed language on page 3, because it refers to the achieved density of the assigned comp plan designation as determined in your city's BLI. And so my question is, we're still talking evaluation of land to be included stage. We haven't applied comprehensive plan designations yet, so is the expectation that we're going to look at a potential plan designation at this level, but potentially discount the capacity? Or are we looking at some other measure of density to see how some parcel between 2 and 5 acres, how they might compare depending on their level of development and how much capacity they have for housing? And I hope that question makes sense.
It does, and it may be that I'm wrapped around the axle a little bit too, Damien. So I appreciate you pointing that out. We have had conversation with folks about those folks like 3J and Echo Northwest who do a lot of these evaluations, and I think at this point we're not yet talking about excluding from the study area. So I apologize for the timeline. We're not moving in a terribly linear fashion here. We're talking about the area of consideration when a city is selecting or looking at sub areas. And some sub areas might be more parcelized than others. The parcelization parcelization is only considered in the exclusion from a study area in the context of employment uses right now. There is not a mechanism in the study area phase to exclude land that is parcelized, to my knowledge, except in the context of employment use. And I could be corrected on that, but I just wanted to make sure that that's clear. In the parcelization conversation about selection of subareas, some subareas may have big parcels that are 10, 20, 30 acres in size, and then other subareas might have much smaller subunits of land. So in this case, we're talking about units that are 5 acres or smaller. And in that context, it appears that they're in those balancing factors that parcelization is recognized as a barrier. And I think we could all admit that there's a little bit more challenge with developing land that already has something on it than land that doesn't. And that's not, that's something that ought to be recognized to some extent in the selection process. What I do hope to build more understanding around is when you're looking at those sub areas and balancing all the factors, to Al Johnson's point, yield is a consideration, and yield is the barrier in this context. That parcelized land is not going to yield nearly as much as a larger lot or an arrangement of larger lots, and therefore it's a challenge that cities have to think through, because they, on the one hand, need to meet a need, and the need is in units and translated from units into land. And the choices are land and a discussion about how many units you could put on them in order to realize or satisfy the need. And the best way to do that is that question, I think, here. So I'm trying to understand, first of all, how a city might assume or quantify the value or the yield of each of those sub areas, except or outside of relative cost. Relative cost to serve kind of gets to it because ultimately you have a certain size pipe and a certain size road that has to serve an area. But there's really not a whole lot of discussion right now about how much those sub areas might generate. And I'm trying to find a data point that cities may have already, i.e. achieved density, historical trends, other kinds of market understanding that a city could use to apply to certain sub areas to show, first of all, that this sub area might produce more than another sub area. And then two, that if this sub area is parcelized, it's unlikely to produce the same amount of the same quantity of land because it's in smaller pieces.
All right, thank you. I have one quick follow-up question because I know people are lining up. So I think that helps because I think if we're focusing on yield, my next question is what density are we using to measure that yield? Because if we're not applying comprehensive plan designations yet, are you using like an achieved average density? Or if we're looking at, say, comparing sub areas based on how much say multi-unit housing they might generate, is that an appropriate time to then say, look, let's look at these other sub areas, but compare them to how much yield they might generate using our achieved density and our, say, high medium density residential designation. So I'll stop there because you got a queue lighting up.
That's good, Damien. Great question, great follow-up question. Thank you for that. I think one of the things we'll get to when we get into the conversation about coordinated public facilities is that this question of capacity and how that capacity is met through utility service is still at question, and how cities compare the pieces. Maybe you need to know what you're trying to serve or the capacity you're trying to serve in order to accurately estimate costs. And so we'll come back to that. I just want to put a pin in that to say that we'll come back to it when we speak about coordinated public facilities in the next section.
Sounds good.
All right.
Thanks, Damon. I think it's well pointed out that at this point, the areas you're looking at don't have comprehensive plan designations. So, Brock, go ahead.
Yeah, two things. I'll do the quick one first. In the proposed C, I think we should change that to 16 years just so that it aligns with a multiple of what the planning cycle is for most cities. I don't know how you count something that only applies for 3/4 of a planning cycle. That doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. But a broader question. Why don't we add a new subsection B in sub 5 where it's talking about that existing parcelization for employment land and just make a new one for residential land as well? I think we're all acknowledging that it's not necessarily suitable in the immediate term to provide that housing, right? It's going to take a while to get that developed to urban densities. Why don't we put that in 5?
Thanks, Brock. Martha.
Thanks. So a couple of things, and conceptually, I think this is a good idea to be able to discount capacity or yield of some of these parcelized lots. I think, and I agree with what Damien was talking about the language about the comprehensive plan designation. I have another language question, and it's this idea of may versus shall. And so under A, it says you may assume development capacity of one dwelling unit per lot, which implies that you could assume more density if you think it's going to happen. But then, of course, the second part of that is you shall assume a certain density for certain size lots, and then we're adding you shall assume this 50% basically reduction. But I guess I'm curious why that's not may. Like, why are you not being permissive rather than directive? And so maybe there's a reason, maybe there's not, but that's something to think about, because I think there may be situations where where there are parcelized lots at 5 acres that probably could develop at a greater density than that. And so, yeah, so that's the first part of my comment. And the second part is, I'm going to think about what Brock said because, adding it to five is very different than what we're adding here. Those are two very, very different concepts. And I think that what Maddie was trying to say is we're not trying to sort of change the priority system and the way that land is excluded for residential. And I'm not sure that I totally agree with that, but I think it's something worth, the conversation worth pursuing.
To clarify, that would be separate from the 5 acre piece here. It would just be the 2
Yes.
acre
Oh,
added to sub 5, at least. I think that would be a good.
Thanks both. Maddie, did you want to comment on the may versus shall?
Sure. Thanks, Martha. I appreciate you picking that up. There is no there is no preference. I think that was probably a Scrivener's error on my part, that those are inconsistent. And I would agree with your proposal that it remain open as an opportunity, but not a requirement of cities. Just to sneak a couple comments in here while there's an opportunity to do so. I think, if we think about the outcomes of discounting the yield expectations of parcelized land, we might see cities taking in more of it, which I think meets the expectations of the land prioritization scheme earlier in section 67. If we think about that a little bit more deeply, we might see that potentially there's less resource land in the mix of what cities identify in their sub areas, because cities might be taking in acreage. If we're really speaking specifically to the gross acres that are needed, we might see cities taking a lot more rural residential exception land and potentially have less need for the larger resource land parcels. At the same time, I just wanted to add from the memo that this could potentially affect a city's ability to realize the potential, given that the land is parcelized. And so we might need to think about what companion actions, things like that a city might consider ultimately in their housing production strategy, among other places, as to how cities might think about the eventual urbanization of the land that they select. Thanks for the opportunity to sneak a few things in, and we'll go to, I think, Heather's next.
Yeah, thanks for those trade-offs, Maddie. Heather, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, ditto about the comprehensive plan designation. That was a question we had. And then ditto about the may versus shall, and supporting in A and B, having all of that be may. And then related to that, so A has, the first sentence is one acre or less. The second sentence is 1 to 2 acres, and then B is less than 5. Is it supposed to be 2 to 5, or is it less than 5? Is it 0 to 5? And originally I was going to say, I assumed it was supposed to be applicable to 2 to 5. But as we're talking about safe harbors and flexibility, I think that's a question I would have, is that you could potentially see somebody saying, well, 0 to, I could actually, based on the areas we're looking at, they all would fit well that are under 5 acres in B, and we're not using any part of A. So I just wasn't sure if that was the intent, but I just wanted to mention it. Thanks.
Thanks, Heather. You'll all see that my attention in this topic was really focused on the outcomes, and I appreciate your attention to the language and the detail there. I think very much so, Heather, that there was not an intentional omission of the 1 and 2 acre option in A. It kind of could go either way. The way I look at it, and forgive me for being kind of blunt, but the way that I guess what I'm trying to approach, the attitude I'm approaching this with is, it would be very advantageous for cities to bring rural residential land into their urban growth boundaries and save. There aren't really great ways to incentivize that, except to provide certain opportunities for, I guess I would call this encouragement. And if encouragement should extend into those 1 and 2 acre parcel size lots, I'd love to hear that conversation here. At this point, my understanding was that the 1 and 2 acre safe harbor in A was working fairly effectively. And there wasn't, from our previous conversations, a lot of concern about changing that. But if there is, and there's desire in this room to do so, then we could certainly consider that.
Yeah,
Ethan.
and I just
Oh,
want to say,
sorry, Heather.
appreciate that approach and do support adding the additional safe harbor. I'm just trying to, make it as
Clear.
applicable as possible. So thanks for adding that.
Perfect. Ethan.
Yeah, definitely curious to hear other folks on the relationship between A and B here. I think in terms of the may and shall question in sub B, I think one of the trade-offs that should be considered there, and I would love folks' thoughts, is the shall language provides the opportunity for local governments to just take that 50% and kind of run with it with no further, analysis in that kind of assessment. And I think the may just kind of throws into the mix the question of, what if the cities are not, what additional analysis might they be considering, or what kind of analysis burden does that cause in those assessments? So that's the only, I don't necessarily think we in terms of putting something together for discussion here had thought at that level of detail, but now that it's been raised, I'm curious to hear folks' thoughts on that.
Analysis or deliberation, right? Just internal deliberation or community deliberation. Ted?
Thank you. I'm struggling a little bit with, I think, how the existing rule is structured here. This chapter is all about how to prioritize areas to bring into the urban growth boundary. And so parcelization can be one of those factors you would look at. But then the way 6 is written really kind of jumps to past tense, lands added to the UGB, and is really trying to estimate what you might get in terms of yield out of it. So I'm wondering if some parsing of those two different things, how you choose areas versus what kind of capacity might you get out of them, might be helpful, or are they too intertwined?
I'd have to agree with you, Ted. We've been working through Division 24 and thinking about some of the ways that rules have been placed there because they were part of a consideration related to a growth boundary amendment, but really in some of the reformation of the housing capacity analysis, some of these pieces may belong better in, say, Division 8. If they are truly a safe harbor related to capacity analysis versus the selection of sub areas, for example. So not to say that this is categorically one of those, but we're on the lookout for those types of organizational suggestions. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the thing that I'm trying to figure out is, what's the language that would create a factor where you can weigh the relative parcelization of one candidate area versus another. And this seems to be going down a different path in looking at yield.
Would your suggestion, to make sure I understand, would your suggestion in this case, knowing that we're trying to estimate the yield of a particular sub area, be to bring that wording into present tense when comparing, for example, lands to be added to the growth boundary?
It's some of it. I mean, I think you quickly get into some of the trade-offs that you were outlining, though, that you may need more acreage if an area is heavily parcelized. That doesn't mean not to do it, though. There may be other good reasons under other factors to bring in a parcelized area. So I don't have a solution. I'm seeing some dissonance. Thanks.
Thanks.
Ted. Brock, go ahead.
So, and I promise this isn't a flippant question. I just heard the department say that there was an advantage to cities bringing in the parcelized lands. In terms of achieving housing production, what is the advantage of incentivizing parcelized lands to be brought in? Because the way I see that, that is an advantage to reinforcing the priority scheme, but it is not an advantage to housing production. And so I'm wondering whether the intent of this is to produce more housing or whether it's to reinforce the priority scheme, because those are two very different outcomes and we're only directed to do one of them in this rulemaking.
Brock, I don't have a direct answer to your question, but I can tell you that the opportunity was focused on a combination of preserving the land prioritization as described in Division 2467 and providing a way to reconcile exception lands. So exception meaning exactly that it is an exception to our urban versus rural use.
Right, but nothing that's been proposed here, it suggested that the prioritization order be changed, right? What we're talking about is whether or not the land is going to be suitable for housing. We're not changing the prioritization statute. We're just saying, yeah, that maybe that's not farmland either, but we also know that it's not going to get us as much housing as if we're able to get a lot where a developer can come in and offset through economies of scale the cost of producing the units.
Thanks, Brock.
So,
Ethan? Yeah.
yeah, what I'd say that it is the priority scheme is what it is. And in working in the context of that regulatory framework and thinking about what is the impact of that priority scheme on the development of housing production, this is one of the considerations that we're proposing to say, look, there is an assessment that local governments could do. There's a way for local governments to think about the yield, the capacity of those lands that are in the higher priorities, in the consideration of what they might actually produce as in terms of housing production. And I think this is trying to formalize that reality that I think we've all been talking about here in this advisory committee process.
Okay. I still don't see that as changing the priority scheme. Those lands are still in the priority scheme. But when we're talking about housing production, I don't understand how that makes sense.
Noted, Brock. Thanks. Al?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Ted. I had some of the same concerns. I think it's really important to be able to incentivize parcelization and urban development, appropriate housing development on residential lands that are, on rural exceptional lands. That's kind of the goal. So the incentive part is extremely important. It's not going to produce a factual basis for assuming greater yields until you have some experience on the ground. It may be at this point appropriate to put into an action plan, a strategic action plan or housing plan, and then have a look at how that's worked out after 5 or 10 years. So I think it's really a good thing to separate out the incentive concept because it has a very important place in achieving what we want to achieve. But we don't want to be counting our chickens before they're hatched.
Mary Kyle. Oh, you're on mute.
What Al just asked echoed something that I asked Maddie about. Do we have any examples on the ground? And Al, I think we'd have to look back a lot more than 5 or 10 years because, as you know, I can show you hundreds of acres of farmland brought into UGBs that have taken more than 10 years to develop, and some are still not developed. I think we'd have to look back at the beginning of urban growth boundaries and, what were functionally rural residential areas that were included in urban growth boundaries in the beginning and see how they've developed over time. But no one's done that because I think it's a long process to develop land regardless of its parcelization. But I had a question because I thought I understood this, but now I'm not sure I do. So does the 5-acre assumption apply to and the 50% yield apply to all rural residential parcels that are less than 5 acres, or only to those that cannot reasonably redevelop or infill within the planning period due to the location of existing structures and infrastructure? Because there are rural residential areas that might be right next to existing infrastructure. I'm just not sure how those parts play together.
Thanks for bringing that up, Mary Kyle. And it was that whole section 5 in perhaps it's just the proximity of that section to the safe harbor that's provided for 1 and 2 acre parcels in part 6. That I had to read section 5 about 4 different times to really understand that it was applicable only to exception land. There's a little bit of a typo in that. You'll see in the memo there's like a Scrivener error that we promised to resolve as part of as a conforming component of the rulemaking. In any event, you bring up a great point, because I think it wasn't more than a month or so ago at our last RAC meeting that a community development director who's a member of the RAC went on record and said there are areas that if we brought them in, added them to our UGB, it'd be easier to serve those than there are places inside the city.
Right. I can think of a few places that I've been involved with where that's the case.
And in that case, does the city need encouragement to bring those parcels in the same way that perhaps the city needs encouragement to bring parcels in that are rural residential exception that are really far afield from their closest service location, I guess is the question to the group. The way it's written right now in this version 1 draft is that the qualifiers are both size and proximity.
Okay. Okay, thanks. I just want to make sure I understood how it was drafted. Thank you.
That said, many of those rural residential exception lands in a UGB study area for selection are likely far from utilities, though there certainly is a subset of those that are close.
Definitely a mix. Thanks.
Steve, we can't hear you, sorry.
Now I was on mute. Yeah. I was just saying thanks, everybody. That was good food for thought, I think, Maddie, for this topic, and some concepts to go back and take a closer look at. Are you ready to move on to the next topic?
We are. Thank you, Steve. And thanks all for your open-mindedness and your attention to detail. I appreciate it. Let's see if we can get into coordinated public facilities. So this is a discussion topic that is front of mind. Forgive me for having a lot of interest in this as the public facilities planner at DLCD within the housing division. And I consistently think about the provision of utilities as a pre-qualifier or potentially a companion to land use that has yet to really be connected effectively to the way that we do long-range planning. Some folks have been doing it for a long time and have some cities have been really successful in this work. Some cities really haven't been, and we're trying to think about how to bring these two arts together. Our land use art of urban form and some of the key tenets of the land use program, and the mechanics of how to serve it and what are some of the efficient and effective ways to do that that typically rely on engineering capacity and some of the more complex thinking around that topic. In terms of coordinating public facilities, we know that this topic comes up when we talk about the inability to serve or ruling out land that is inordinately costly to serve or complicated to serve. And then there's some increasingly detailed engineering analysis that we see that concludes costs to serve that compares the sub area. So forgive me, in this topic, we're gonna bounce from section 65 and back to 67. 65 is the section that talks about excluding land from the study area because it's impracticable to serve. And then we'll move into division 2467, which speaks to comparative or relative cost and thinking about some certainty or adding some certainty to that work. When we talk about impracticable to serve, so that's you'll see in the memo fairly spelled out those concerns and criteria, and I'll put them up on the screen because there's a section that's of particular interest, part 7B and C rather, that you'll see some proposed amendments in your attachment A. Again, apologies for the disorganization of some of this, but it flowed a little better to keep all that together. You'll also know fairly well that utility planning happens on its own cycle, and so it's not particularly tied to any of the residential planning efforts that we're doing right now. Though many cities will do or coordinate some of their work, it's just not specified in any set of rules that we have right now. Except for when land is being considered for annexation, there is a requirement that land be coordinated, or the land uses be coordinated with the facilities per Division 11 of the Oregon Administrative Rules. Capacity of systems are often assessed. So I've seen a number of urbanization studies that pass muster on their findings for goal 11 when they say we have enough treatment capacity in our sewer plant and we have enough water rights in the river. So by the time urbanization reaches this area, we should be able to serve it. And that's sort of like period, the end. Forgive me for making that statement sound a little bit facetious, but it leaves a lot open to consideration, and there seem to be an inordinate number of surprises that arise from that level of analysis, given the timeline and critical path of development that it takes to reach a particular property. Cost to serve often conflicts with the land prioritization scheme that flat farmland and potentially parcelized rural residential exception land are at odds with one another, perhaps. So there's often an effort in the location factors to balance those two things. And Brock, I appreciate you raising that point at the beginning of our conversation, that balance becomes fairly challenging to cities because it may score highly in 2 or 3 of the categories, but in one category, there's really something that we have to give up or trade off for. And landowners that are included in a sub area, let's say an area is selected, especially if there isn't a fairly robust analysis done to determine how a land area will be served, their confidence level, their likelihood to develop or change how they use their property is quite low until there are plans to serve that property. I apologize for reusing some of the same comparisons with others that I've spoken with, but until you get a door hanger on your door that says, hey, we're thinking about adding you to the growth boundary, and here's how the water and sewer lines are going to run down your street, until that moment, the change that happens to a landowner isn't particularly notable, or there isn't really a change in how people think about utilizing their property. And I can embellish on that story a little bit more as we get further into conversation, but I think there's something there about how we think about coordinating facility services and their planning, and the timing in which cities make decisions to amend their growth boundary. So you'll see 2 things, and we'll take them one by one. Impracticable to serve We'll talk about language to provide better direction to cities to remove truly impracticable areas from consideration. And then we'll talk a little bit after that about time certain updates to public facilities planning that is consistent with the planning program as described in OHNA, with the hope that, I guess, sort of thinking about the outcomes, with the hope that as a city moves into their next capacity analysis, after they've brought land, done a UGB amendment, that in their next capacity analysis, they have some conceptual idea of how they're going to serve that land. Because without the conceptual understanding of how land will be served, it may be highly speculative to assume certain capacity of that land. So we'll move into the conversation, but Al, I see your hand. Please.
That me?
Yes, that's you.
Yeah, okay. I just was thinking about the challenges we have as because of property tax changes and all kinds of things, that so much of what we would typically think of as being essential to public facilities planning is actually private facilities planning now. And a lot of it gets built through the development process as exactions and just by developers who need to do it. Homeowners associations have taken over huge amounts of things, and it's all very ad hoc and unpredictable. There are things that the government can't afford to do and can't promise to do and can't necessarily predict that it will be able to do. But with the help of Echo Northwest, we may be able to predict that another sector will take care of those things in the future. So I just want us to not get overly hung up on concurrency when concurrency is not something the public sector can deliver on. So we need to be a little humble about concurrency.
Thanks, Al, and thanks for bringing up the trade-off that is present in this conversation, which is who does the planning work. When areas are added to the growth boundary and await facilities update, whatever facility or set of facilities that might be, if that property wishes to move faster than the jurisdiction is able to do their update work, it often falls to the private sector to provide conceptual level and potentially all the way up to construction level planning for how that property would be served. And I think there's potentially some trade-off there where cities that spend time and energy trying to conceptually serve those places may find some value in not doing the work until someone says, I'm really ready. And I tried to outline that a little bit in the memo to say, there's some efficiency to a private sector partner, an owner or development group, doing the work it takes to show how the land will be served, because they only do it once, or they do it once with a level, with a subsequent refinement until construction plans are achieved. In this case, we'd be talking about more of a master plan level, like a water master plan or a sewer master plan level evaluation of what is the conceptual alignment of how something will be served, and then leaving that option open to succession of, I would call it critical path, or the order of development that it takes to achieve that geography. So the analytical burden has, like, as you've said before, Al, has historically, like right now, shifted to the private sector. And I think there is a reason to ask cities to be a little bit more intentional about updating their opportunity to steward extensions into newly added growth boundary areas. I'll move into the next. So just to give you some so we're back to impracticable to serve. We're talking about the study area. What areas within the study area ought to be excluded because they are simply too challenging to serve. And one thing that I would highlight very prominently in this conversation is that impracticability to serve relies on the physical characteristics of the land. So this is not necessarily what it will take to serve an area, but it is what is the geography or topography of the area such that it would require more engineering or more engineering than the land itself might yield in order to be served, and therefore must be ruled out. And so I provided part B here because that shows the intent of the section related to impracticability, and where there are some suggestions for changes are based on your conversations back in October to be more explicit and more specific about where there are challenges that cities face that lead to cost and potentially not enough yield to reasonably value those areas in sub-area consideration. So I'll just walk through this quickly. First and foremost, there was some language buried in Part D that I thought was applicable to nearly all of the sections. And so I brought that language up to the top of the rule section, which speaks to features that prohibit or substantially impede the placement or construction of necessary public facilities and services. That outlines a little bit better what we're talking about. Topographic features in particular, I think there was concern on the mural board. What does that mean? What are the standards for topographic features? And it's less, in my understanding, impracticability it's less about what features are there, because we could sit here all day and talk about all the variety of topographic features that pose challenges to the placement of utilities, but really it's the functional outcome that they deliver or don't. In particular, how much they require a deviation from a city's water pressure zone. Can you get fire flows to that place without adding significant pump capacity? Or is there access to gravity flow for sewer? And if not, because the land is too low or it's below the grade of the water treatment facility. These would be areas that a city genuinely would likely express some level of concern, because they would add complexity of engineering to be able to serve them, and potentially would desire ruling them out. Part C, there were comments that freeways, rail lines, and other restricted access corridors was too limiting. My suggestion here is to talk about high capacity transportation corridors where access is limited or where modes are limited. So that speaks to higher order arterials and above that don't afford folks the access by walking or biking, among other services. Knowing that the primary concern about those barriers are connectivity. So, for example, the ability of folks to cross over them and prevent them being a barrier to access, where a person might have to drive in order to cross them. And then finally, a great suggestion from you all, which was another jurisdiction's urban growth boundary, which might also be of concern. You wouldn't want to have to consider that. From there, I'll open it up to conversation, but
Maddie?
again, we're looking at attachment A, and we're talking a little bit about impracticable to serve criteria.
Maddie, before we open it up, I think you have 2 more slides, and I don't think we're going to get to them unless we do it now, because we only have about 15 minutes left.
Okay.
Do you want to walk through those real quick?
I can walk through that, and we can have one big conversation about the whole thing.
Yeah.
Thanks, Steve. Sorry, I've been lost track of time here. Thanks for that. The last topic is coordinating public facilities and their update. One observation I made in reviewing about 5 or 6 urbanization studies that have been done in the last 10 years is that there is a substantial volume of analysis, quantitative and qualitative analysis, that engineering staff typically do to show cost to serve and thinking about how land would be served. However, these estimates are typically done absent a conceptual project. And they're often using a scale of difficulty 0 to 5 or 0 to 10 and a big chart that looks at sometimes different scenarios in the most sophisticated versions. A city makes the decision to select a sub area or set of sub areas, and then all that just gets packed up, put on the shelf, put away. And I'm looking for opportunities for efficiency and potentially some refinement of that analysis. If a city knew that they had to update their utility planning documents within a time certain, would the scope of the engineering work that's performed for that comparative analysis be different? I think the answer is yes. And I would open the opportunity for you all. I guess the second scenario is what I stated earlier, which is at the city's next housing capacity analysis, when they do their next BLI, can a city in earnest estimate the capacity of that newly added land without knowing how it will be served?
All right. Well, we can show the questions on your next slide, but let's go to Brock and hear from you, Brock, and open up the discussion.
Yeah, a couple. I'll try to go quick. One, I think just for cleanup, 7BA could use just a little bit of rewording. I think the amount of development that is likely to occur on land within the planning period is clearer than what's currently there. I like the addition of E there. I think it should be jurisdictions, UGB or urban reserves. We don't want cities fighting over where their urban reserves go or fighting over land that they want to add. And then the other thing that I would say, I like 11, on subsection 9, and this wasn't covered in the slides, but it is in the attachment. There's an addition of when paired with a land use efficiency measure. And this is talking about scenarios where it's not a city expanding their UGB in response to a land deficiency identified in their HCA, right? This is someone saying like, hey, I am a property owner. I want to be added to the UGB. Like, can you bring me in? Why in the world would we need to put efficiency measures on that? Because we already have the requirement for additional efficiency measures when we're doing a UGB expansion anyway. That's already been a proposed addition. But for something like this, where it seems to be talking about a one-off lot where they're just like, hey, can I be added to the UGB? I don't know why you need to put in efficiency measures across the city to be able to do that. So I would recommend not making that change that's shown in 9. Thank you.
Thanks, Brock. Anybody else? Any of our infrastructure savvy folks have any thoughts on these? Mary Kyle, go ahead.
I like the last slide. Also, was it 11? I can't even remember now. But to update within 5 years. I like Brock's addition to adding urban reserves to the urban growth boundary thing. And I don't know if there are special service districts that exist outside that might complicate this whole analysis, but in any event, I disagree with the comments just made about subsection 9. My question was originally, what do you mean by that, by this additional thing? But regardless of the size or how an urban growth boundary is expanded, whether periodic review or legislative review or post-acknowledgement plan amendment, they can be of any size. They're far from being just one small thing, and they all have to comply with goal 10 and goal 14, goal to 10 if they're residential, and goal 14. So efficiency measures are part of that already through existing language. So that seems to me to be a clarification.
That was the intent. Thank you, Mary Kyle.
All right. I think we have enough time. Damien, and then Heather, and then Derek, and then we'll see where we're at.
All right. Thanks, Steve. I'll try to go quickly here. So under 0657C, new changes to B, I really like those regarding considering the water pressure zone elevation, but also gravity sewer service. Those are both, priorities for a city like Bend. Regarding 0659 and the added language about when paired with land use efficiency measures, I think this is where I would ask for some clarity about maybe the scope of the measures or level of effort for looking at some property or properties that are being added to the boundary, and what would be, a commensurate amount of work to look at efficiency measures to show that, yep, we've done some additional work, and here's where we need this additional land to meet our housing need. And then the proposed new 11, I think is doable. I just wanted to offer our experience that we got our UGB expansion acknowledged in 2016 and then adopted the last PFP update in 2021. I was trying to do the math in my head to see if we were just under the radar, but I think we're pretty close. So I think that's a doable time frame to get major updates done to wastewater collection, transportation, and then water PFPs. Thank you.
Thank you, Damien. Heather?
I will follow up with some language about CA, which isn't proposed for revision, but some concerns about the way slope is calculated. And then Maddie, I think we'll want to follow up with you about just to make sure we understand how you're thinking about the level of serviceability analysis, because there was some discussion about the analysis being at the level for future annexation. And so we just kind of want to make sure that we're on the same page before we give additional comments. So I'm just flagging that. Thank you.
Thanks, Heather. Derek?
Yeah, with respect to 11, I don't have any issues with it. From our perspective, though, I mean, the last time we did a large UGB, well, it's actually a large UGB land swap, we went ahead and did the facility planning update right then and there. That was part of the process. We had to get into that level of detail to make sure that we had the expansion area right-sized and appropriate. So it was a refinement. It was a refinement plan that updated various facility plans, and it's done part and parcel with the work. So I'm not that familiar with that. I'm having a hard time thinking of a circumstance where you would defer that a number of years. When I was looking at the information on the under 7C, I don't know. When I read it, I get additional discretionary concepts that I'm not getting additional clarity. Like, for example, what constitutes a significant deviation from a city's water pressure zone? What are we talking about? Multiple pressure zones? Are we talking about the inability to meet 20 psi at the meter? What do we, some additional context or clarity there would be helpful. Same with under where it talks about impediments to service provision are those physical features that prohibit or substantially impede. What substantially impede? Some additional context would be helpful there. On the high capacity transportation corridors, that would be collectors too, correct? I mean, in many jurisdictions, ours included, collector roadways are access restricted. So that can be viewed rather broadly. And is that your intent or not? Those were my comments.
Thank you, Derek. Sarah, and then we'll kind of wrap up for today.
Yeah, just real quick for those cities that perhaps don't do master planning and rely on special districts for some of the facilities plans. How does this coordination? I don't think there's a way to guarantee it, but it'd be nice to see that reflected in a rule that some coordination is required. Maybe that's comes in at a later time through your housing plan. I just wanted to flag that one though. At Clean Water Services, I don't know that we would necessarily hit that 5-year mark, or update all of our master plans within a 5-year cycle. So how does that affect a city in our district?
Thanks, I'll go ahead and follow up with those who just spoke offline, just knowing that we're pressed for time. But I really appreciate you sharing those comments for everyone to hear, and I'll be in touch with you.
Great. Can we go to our final slide? I think what is our final slide? Thanks, everybody, for the conversation today. Really productive. I believe there will be a mural board, right? So keep an eye out for that if there's anything you want to share that you weren't able to today. Our next meeting is August 21st. We are going to be wrapping up, I believe, BLI constraints and talking about development ready land inventory sufficiency. I think that's right. And just a reminder for those who are interested in tracking the RAC conversations, the next RAC meeting is on August 27th. They're going to be talking about urban growth boundaries and urban reserves and reviewing rulemaking impact statements. So that still comes after our next CAUTAC meeting, so you'll get one more reminder of that RAC meeting. But I think that unless any of the DLCD team has anything, parting comments, I think we're good for today. Maddie?
Steve, thanks. I just wanted to express great appreciation for everyone's thinking today. There were some ideas floated around that perhaps were new and pretty far afield of maybe conversations we've had up so far. So I appreciate your open-mindedness. And as I mentioned, you'll see an email from me with a follow-up about the mural board, also with some more information about meetings coming up. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.